Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, everyone who is both in the room and out there in Zoom land. When we had to cancel the refreshments, I was pretty convinced I'd be in the room by myself. So thank you. After hours talks are difficult, but I appreciate those of you who are staying late and here to join me. To start with, so if you're here because you know other things that I have written, I should begin with a caveat that this is not really like the other books. This is an act of public scholarship, or perhaps an attempted act of public scholarship, more than a typical scholarly output. When I was sorting out the question that I wanted to explore in the book and thought about who else might be interested in reading that story, I came to the conclusion that probably the biggest audience wasn't the one that I usually talk to. So this is not a deep dive into scholarship at all, but it's an attempt to really engage with a regular conversation that takes place in popular publications about technology and media and our world. But it's definitely at a level that, well, I imagine it as a business casual book. I invented a category for the business casual reader. And my hope is that someday there are airports and this book is in it and people grab it and get on a plane and read it on their journey. But we'll see. We're getting closer to that happening, I think. For those of you who saw the title, have no idea who I am, let me begin with who I am and why I'm here to talk about this today. I've been studying how internet communication technologies disrupted the television business since the early 2000s. So actually, that story obviously starts with cable and satellite. And as I finished this book, that is a 20-year account of the change in the US industry around 2017, I became curious about how the story that I had just written compared with other media industries. So let's go back to 2017. At that point, I was trying to make sense of early calls for greater regulation of what was often simply described as the tech industry. So this was a time of acronyms like GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. But as someone who studies the business of media, I was confused why these companies were being conflated. Netflix is not at all like the other four, and the other four are actually not really much alike either. Part of the issue was the extent to which the popular imagination had latched on to the notion of a common tech industry that was composed of companies that were relatively new and used the internet in some way. Now, this tech rhetoric has been out there for 20 years, and it's come to seem quite natural, but maybe imagine it's not really as all-encompassing as we might think. So maybe because I remember life before internet communication technologies, I do see a lot of difference between the company that I started buying books from near the end of graduate school, a company I might turn to for a vacation rental, and a company that offers a library of on-demand video. In other words, I see a lot of variation. I see a lot of companies in different sectors, all with different stories about disruption in different ways. 20 years into digital disruption, I was curious to understand what had happened and what could be learned by businesses facing future technological disruptions by studying what had happened in the fairly recent past. I knew the story of what had happened, at least in the US and at least in television, but I began to read broadly. Of course, I quickly came across Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma and his idea of disruptive innovation. As I read the early work, I certainly saw disruptive innovation being applied to in many of the ways that internet communication technologies were disrupting industries, the media sector, and otherwise. But the ideas really didn't seem to align. For example, Netflix seemed like it would be the quintessential case of disruptive innovation based on what those words normally mean. But as I worked through the criteria, it didn't really fit. I should note that Christensen looked at Netflix 1.0. It's the version of Netflix where it was offering DVDs by mail in the US, and he did argue that that fit the model. But we now know that the disruption of Netflix is much greater than what it did to the Blockbuster company. So I was curious to see what I would find if I came at this question from the opposite direction. Instead of looking for a grand, all-encompassing theory that would explain technological disruption, what if I dug into a sector that I knew pretty well, media, and started exploring how internet communication technologies had affected multiple industries and began to look for commonalities and patterns in that story? I started to pull together a parallel narrative from what I had found in television with newspapers, recorded music, and film. I had some help. Film industry, expert Dan Herbert, and music industry expert Lee Marshall, who I collaborated on another project about streaming across different media, helped with those respective chapters. And I taught a capstone seminar for 3 consecutive seminars or semesters in which students worked in groups to investigate one of the industries. And we worked on working out the defining factors and the ongoing challenges. So their thinking is in this book as well. And this story is based more in the US than elsewhere, although with the exception of newspapers, the US media industries do produce product for global audiences, so I suspect that there are parallels for these industries in other national contexts as well. And the story of what happened in each, the recorded music, newspaper, television, and film industries are each discrete chapters in this book, which I think is available in Australia, certainly in its e-form, but if it's not here yet, it will be here soon. It's a very bad book event, launch event, because I don't have any to share, but it exists, I can prove it. So let's begin though, before we get into those specific stories, with some preliminary propositions. First off is the idea that internet distribution has brought industry disruption, not mere evolution. So every industry is constantly in the midst of change. There's a playing field, there's new competitors, there's new regulations, there's every day run-of-the-mill new technologies that lead to playing field adjustments. Yeah. One of the metaphors that I use in the book is the idea of, in sport, materials are constantly improving, right? So we have lighter and stronger materials that now allow batters to hit farther. But when we're talking about disruption, what we're really talking is something more akin to introducing the ability to use your hands to the game of what I would call soccer and many of you football, right? So really the playing field going from here to here. The pieces can't remain the same. It's not a situation of minor adjustment, but the fundamental conditions really change in significant ways. Secondly, the argument that I've alluded to, that tech is not an industry, and that to understand disruption that has been brought by the internet and all of its communication capacities, we need to accumulate sector-specific stories. I do understand the impulse, and I wish I could do nothing more than write the article. That's 3 simple steps to solve your business's technological disruption worries. But after digging into just 4 companies or 4 sectors, I can say that the story is just too complicated. That said, and a minor spoiler alert here, the story across the 4 sectors isn't the same. But there are pieces that do come together. There are parallels or patterns that can be pulled out and might offer some guidance in facing these questions going forward. And finally, sort of setting us in the media space, the argument that internet technologies aren't new media, but rather a new technology for distributing media. So throughout this talk, we're going to go in the time machine a few times. If we go into the time machine and go back to the early 2000s, the discourse of new media was everywhere. The expectation was the internet was bringing new media. In many cases, the idea was that it would probably kill old media. And I think because that was how it was framed, and that was what the expectation was, that it led legacy, those old media, to think about the change in a certain way that wasn't particularly productive. So what do I mean by it's a new distribution technology? So if we go back to the 90s, early 2000s, we have blogs. What are blogs? Blogs are words distributed using the internet. Unlike, also like, newspapers that are words distributed on paper, which is also like, and not unlike, what newspapers had been a century earlier, which was words distributed on rags. Right? Over time, we have a history of constant evolution of distribution technology. It leads the industries to stay the same in some ways. Depending on the new affordances, it also leads to change. Another example is broadcasting, right? So broadcasting was the primary distribution technology for video until fairly recently. We've got cable and satellite in there as well. Broadcasting has certain capabilities. The entire sector of television largely developed based upon those abilities and those limitations, things like a schedule, the way in which it was integrated into everyday life. The fact that most broadcasting was based on ad support because you couldn't exclude it, right? Once you sent out the signal, if someone put up an antenna, they got it, right? You couldn't keep someone from doing it. What do streaming services bring us? Streaming services use the internet to distribute video. They aren't new media. The internet has affordances and capabilities that broadcasting doesn't. It can offer content on demand. It allows us much more choice that way. Also, it is excludable. So it was able to introduce a new business model, one largely based on subscriber funding, which has introduced shifts in metrics of success and the kind of content being created. So understanding that at its core, media disruption comes from a new distribution technology rather than this idea that there's some sort of new form of media. I think it was really useful for me in understanding what was happening in television. All right. So what happened to the media industries? The general story is that it depends on the kindling. Kindling is a concept that I get from an author named Bharat Anand. He's a Harvard Business School professor in his book, The Content Trap, which also talks about digital disruption. And Anand opens his book with a metaphor of the wildfire, right? So what is disruption? What is disruptive? A wildfire that comes in, takes out what was a forest and leaves nothing behind, disruptive. Right? And so he talks specifically about a massive forest fire in a national park in the US in the late 1800s. And he goes through the case and he talks about how when we have disruption of that scale, often people first turn to try and think about, well, what caused it, right? So was it a lightning strike? Was a campfire left unattended, a discarded cigarette, right? So if we can figure out what caused it, maybe we can keep it from happening again. This is another step that management, assessors often make, is to then focus on how it was managed improperly. So in that case, there was some controversy. At one stage in the fire, they let it burn, and perhaps maybe a better move would have been to try and snuff it out. In other words, second guess the strategy. And he says, okay, that's understandable. But if you want to understand and you want to prevent disruption, you need to understand what makes it spread, the kindling. In other words, you can do some things to keep it from happening, but lightning strikes we're not going to stop, right? So what can you do? You can make sure you've cleared your kindling, and that discourages the likelihood. So what is the equivalent of that when we apply it away from fires into the media sector? In media, kindling was significantly tied to how well different industries offered the experiences that people wanted to have. So just to illustrate this, I argue in the book that of the four industries, the movie industry has been the least disrupted. And a lot of the reason for that is because the kindling in the movie industry had been cleared about 40 years ago. Again, in the time machine, go back, if you can, to the early 80s and the availability of movies. You could go to the cinema. Of course, you were limited to what was being shown and you had to turn up at the time that it was being offered. You could watch film on television. Again, you're limited to what a programmer decides is a movie that a lot of people will want to watch. And again, you have to watch it at the time they offer it. But other than that, film was pretty inaccessible. You certainly couldn't have, select, I would like to watch X movie and watch it now. And so the disruption, the kindling clearing for the movie industry largely happened with the video cassette, right? A technology notably that the film industry, as we understand it, did not bring to bear. It came from the consumer electronics sector. And the film industry, at least in the US, fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. because they were so concerned with what it would do to theater going and its business model. So this is studio revenue from 1980 to 2005. The steady black line along the bottom is theatrical revenue, the money that is spent at the box office that goes back to the studio. So that is what we call a pretty flat line. The revenue increase experienced by the industry over time is that gray dash, right? So it turned out that rather than being a threat to the scarcity that the film industry had created by making it difficult to access films, that enabling people to rent them through video cassettes and then buy them on DVDs turned out to be quite valuable for their business. So valuable, in fact, that upon the early ages or parts of the streaming story, the industry was very upset about the way in which they were now losing that revenue as a result of yet new ways of distributing movies. So to tie this back to the Kindling, it's understanding how different sectors, so the fact that in the film industry, movies were pretty accessible with VHS and DVD. We weren't all the way there, right? It was still somewhat inconvenient to go to a rental store or to actually buy the DVD. If you know the story, the supposed origin story behind Netflix, it allegedly originated out of the annoyance of having to go to the video store and then the late fees that accumulate if you don't return your video on time. So yes, so the ability to either have your movies brought to you or then with streaming, the ability to just sit down in front of a screen and select from a wide array, those were experiential gains. So there was some kindling remaining in the industry, but not nearly as much as there was in the other industries. When I started this book, or the title for the book early on, at least in my head, was Myths of the Digital Era. And that came from the fact that as I researched the different industries and started putting together the story, in almost every case, there was a pithy little one-liner that kind of encapsulated what many people may perceive to have happened in the industries. And often there was a kernel of truth in those pithy aphorisms, but also they weren't right, or they were only the first chapter of a much longer story. And so those are the chapter titles in the book. And in terms of such sayings, obviously, we must begin with the notion that piracy killed the music industry. Now, this is a story that music industry experts have covered thoroughly quite some time ago, actually. And so I'm not going to go back through and re-articulate the way in which unauthorized streaming at the beginning of the 21st century really wasn't the near death of the music industry. Instead, let's start with kindling. And let's start again with what it was like to listen to music in the 1990s, so pre-digital. So what are our options? You can listen to the radio, right? There's different formats, so you can kind of, get a narrow choice at least. In many cases, radio is commercial. So on one hand, it's free, but you have to sit through commercials. Okay, so that's one experience. Or you can buy music. And there's a long history of that, dating back to sheet music, right? Like that was the norm. It was on a physical form. If you wanted it, you could buy it. There was a bit of kindling there in terms of the experience. And certainly, probably people didn't really feel bad about buying music. They never knew that there'd be another way to have music other than to buy it. But, did we really want to own it? Some people did, for sure. But maybe did all of us? Right? So you had to buy it. You had to buy it in a bundle, right? So part of that, again, is tied to the physical format. It didn't really make sense as long as it was a physical form to print, distribute, retail every single song. It made sense for the industry. It made sense more practically to bundle a bunch of songs together. But for the most part, did we want the album, or did we often really only want a single song? So some kindling there. They were pricey bundles, especially CDs. In many cases, when the recording industry moved from vinyl records to cassettes and introduced CDs, they increased the price of that bundle by as much as 50%, even though it cost them less to produce and distribute and retail. So, early on, that's pretty standard, but the prices remain high. And that's one of the things that a lot of music industry experts point to as one of the kindling setting conditions for what happened at the turn of the century, which was a period of significant unauthorized file sharing. But what was the cause of that unauthorized file sharing? Was it really about not wanting to pay, or was it wanting access and an experience of music that was different from the one that the industry was insistent on providing, right? So probably many of you know, basically the rough pieces of the story from there. iTunes steps in and offers a authorized and paid way to access or to buy music files. We think that that's like, okay, the new thing, but before we can really figure anything out, we're moving again to the reality that we know now of streaming services. And what are streaming services? Well, they offer really a range of experiences. If you want to still listen to albums, you certainly can. And of course, you can still buy them. But you also can listen to particular songs. You can put together your own playlists. You can get playlists from other people. You can have music recommended to you based on things that you've listened to before. So if we think about how experiences change, I think that story and how audiences have moved in their consumption explains a lot, or how combustible, let's say, the kindling was. The music industry is an interesting case to start with. It experiences the disruption first chronologically. And it's also fascinating because on one hand, it is incredibly disrupted, and yet in other ways, it's kind of not really that disrupted at all, right? The labels are at the center of the universe at the beginning, and they're still there, very much so. And the streaming services are certainly players in the sector now, but the labels are largely intact. But the sector's primary revenue stream has entirely changed. And how many industries go through that and remain largely intact, right? So the industry goes from consumer payment being their primary source of revenue to licensing that comes from the streaming services, largely completely replacing that revenue stream. There's a significant disruption. So I had to end the book at some point. It's roughly 2020. And I expect that there's more change to come. So I don't know how far we are along the story. It seems to me that the macro structures are now in place, and that the change from here is largely sort of at a middle level, right? So it looks like there may still be some kindling, but perhaps it's the kindling that's emerging from some inefficiencies or suboptimal relationships between the labels, the artists, and the streaming services. And if you change that dynamic a little bit, it could yield some significant changes. But we'll have to wait and see if there's a second edition of the book to sort that one out. The next industry, the newspapers. This is a hard story. So I've chosen information wants to be free, even though I should note that as it exists in the tech lore, as it was originally uttered, it had literally nothing to do with newspapers. But it captures well a perception of what happened in that industry. It's a story, that version of the myth has to do with the way that newspapers' original sin was allowing any content out for free and teaching people that they didn't have to pay for news, and therefore where we are now is their own fault. The story is more complicated, as you might expect. The kindling question doesn't work as well here. Well, it does, but you've got to be a little clever. And you have to recognize that the core business of the newspaper was not providing news and journalism. It was selling attention for advertisers. So in much of the world, 70 to 80% of newspaper revenue came from advertisers. So the news, the journalism, the things that we read and paid roughly 20 to 30% of their revenue for, either in a subscription or at the newsstand, that was to attract that attention. And it worked. In a certain period of time and the ways that you could attract attention, it worked well. But there was kindling, not necessarily kindling for us as readers, but kindling for the advertisers. And what happened, or what one of the things that internet communication technologies provided, were better or new or different advertising tools for advertisers. First one, search. So instead of an advertiser putting an ad in a paper and hoping the right people see it and maybe they'd be impressed with it, search allows advertisers the capacity to put their company, their message in front of consumers at the moment in which they're Googling something. Google or any other search engine for that matter. All right, that is a different tool. If you are an advertiser, there is an advantage to that is different from a display ad. There is less difference between a traditional advertising or newspaper display ad and social media, which is the other thing that internet communication technologies offer advertisers that is new and different and attractive. One of the key things about that social media space is how much attention it is gathering, right? In this talk, I'm going to use the word newspapers because it is awkward to use anything else, but I do not necessarily just mean papers, right? These daily words organizations, whether they deliver those words to us online or in print, as most of them are now hybrid, if not entirely online, that's not where we spend our time. If you are based on reaching audience eyeballs and trying to provide attention, that's not where you want to put your message. So the story of the newspaper industry is one of fundamental collapse of the business model. And as a result, sort of no amount of moving around or shuffling around the journalism is actually going to change that dynamic. Another factor, though, in what has happened in that industry is the extent to which the value proposition of what newspapers provided has been steadily eroded. Again, by different parts of internet communication technology. For example, think back to a pre-digital time, and if you would have wanted to know what the weather is like at 3:15 in the afternoon, right? And there's nothing you can search, right? You might have sat around and waited for the radio broadcast or a news bulletin, or you looked around the house and figured out, oh, there's the newspaper, and you check it, right? That's a really thin thing. It's information. It's not really the core of what we think a newspaper provides, but that was part of the value proposition. All of that information is now available to us, often with a few quick clicks, often for free. So that has come out of the bundle. Another piece, I'm going to make a distinction between news and journalism. And I do that because they have been affected differently. By news, I mean that thin layer of detail of what's happening, right? It's mostly what we get in television and radio news broadcasts, perhaps accepting the public broadcasters that do give us a bit more depth. But it's that what happened today kind of level of news, which honestly, we know is what, probably not the people in this room, but what many people, is the threshold for what they're after in any given day. That news is ubiquitous. You can go to a website. You can, if you have a social media feed, even without clicking on anything, you can probably scroll through it and figure out what's happening. And there's still radio, and there's still television, which is why newspaper circulation has been in decline since the 1940s. That part was not new, right? Other places to access news, substitutes, eroded the business. So that leaves journalism, which unfortunately is the most expensive part and is the part that we need, right? So I think one of my hopes is that coming at the analysis this way helps illustrate the ways in which our efforts to shore up the situation in journalism have perhaps in some cases been misguided, right? So efforts by different governments around the world to try to fix commercial newspapers and to provide them with extra supports, it's really, for anything that's advertiser supported, likely too late. And instead of trying to figure out how to save newspapers, focusing attention on how to save journalism, the things that aren't being made possible by different bits of the new internet information economy, is more likely to get us what we need in order for a proper functioning democracy, and to provide those pieces that we most miss due to the unbundling of newspapers and the emergence of different ways of gathering attention. Next up, the notion held by some film directors in particular that Netflix is destroying Hollywood. So the film industry is a really interesting case, as I've suggested already, in that it experienced so much disruption 40 years ago. And it is kind of stunning and not that we haven't looked back at that history or recognized the parallels of the past to the present and had fewer of the panics and anxieties that we've had, but we also know that we often don't look at the history the way that we should. The story of what has happened in the film industry comes down, first of all, to the fact that the film industry is not a monolith. And it comes down to tension in between two sectors: the production, the entities that make the movies. In the US, they're often called studios, and the exhibitors, the people who own the cinemas. They feel pretty differently about internet communication technologies. The studios pretty much say, hey, we make films, people like films. There's now new ways for people to get our films. We're gonna be okay. Exhibitors, somewhat less so, right? And the story, the industry class that I taught in the US every semester, there'd be a story that would suggest an end to the stalemate. Literally 2 decades, the same thing every year. It's like Groundhog Day. Stalemate, right? So what happens? The studios say something like, oh, we're gonna try doing this film day and date on an on-demand service. And then the cinemas say, if you do that, we will show none of your films. And then the studios say, okay. And this happened for 2 decades. And then this is a part of the talk where I should mention that I delivered this manuscript initially in February of 2020. And then some other things happened in the world. But in honesty, the book for the most part is a 20-year story from 2000 to 2020. So, it wasn't entirely set askew, but there were some words that needed to be added to talk about the thing that happened in film, which was the studios had cover, right? So with cinemas offline, the studios have had 20 or so months to learn a whole lot, right? We can release different kinds of films in different ways. We'll try some films direct, let's say, and Disney to our streaming Disney Plus service. Some films will put in the Disney Plus service and make people pay $30 for. Oh wait, Australia, you're not locked down. Huh. We'll take some films and we'll release them direct to our streaming service in the US, while the rest of the world can still go to theaters, and we'll see what happens. So for 20 months, the studios have been gathering the kind of perspective that I think they've wanted for a long time, that will help them as we enter a new era, better gauge the extent to which the somewhat extortionary position of the cinemas is valid. In the social media business news universe that I live in, there's been a lot of talk in the last year about the end of cinemas. And I think that talk is overblown. A lot of the people that make having that talk are people who are Wall Street analysts. And yes, in the US in particular, the era of cinemas as a certain kind of investor grade product might not be the same as it was. But that's not the same as cinemas dying. And in fact, I think if we look to the story about Kindling and things like that, and we look back, you saw that line, right? People started watching a lot of video at home in the 1980s, and they still went to the theater. Yes, that was the only place to see first-run movies, but they still went to the theater. It's not a perfect substitution, right? People go to the theater for a certain kind of experience. They often want to watch movies far more than they can actually get to cinema. Perhaps we are at a point now where the cinemas will begin to recognize that people would like to have different kinds of experiences when they enter their doors. That it isn't just first-run films that maybe they'd be interested in seeing. That maybe there are certain classic films or favorite films that are worth a night out and exciting to see on the big screen, things that never had space given the amount devoted to the first-run studio offerings. Again, the second edition we will see, but I'm not predicting the immediate end of cinemas anywhere. And at last, the end of television as we know it. This was a title of so many newspaper articles and consultancy reports from roughly the period of 2006 to 2009. I almost can't explain it, the giddiness with which the notion of the end of television was embraced. In the book, I talk a bit about one of the reasons I believe was an active hope among the American audience. And it was a hope that the internet and its bringing of new media would present a way out of the control of cable providers. There is no more hated entity in the American environment than cable providers and satellite. And it's not entirely their fault. We can say due to a series of non-competitive marketplace conditions, it is simply the case that 90% of Americans were paying more than $100 US monthly for access to a big bundle of cable channels, and it was that or nothing. And people weren't happy, and so perhaps some hoped for the end. If we go back to what the Kindling was, even as someone who was very closely studying television at the time, I don't think I could have seen the Kindling. And I just assumed, you get to watch an hour of a drama this week, and you have to wait another week until you can see the next one. It's just how it is. Who would have thought? Or again, in the US context where we don't have rules about number of minutes of commercials, you can watch that show, but you have an increasingly large amount of minutes per hour taken over by commercials. It's a real drag. It's kindling. It's an unpleasant experience. And so I think because those things were so unthinkable, I don't think the industry appreciated really what it was that Netflix was doing as it came in and began offering streaming in the late aughts. Because at that time, it was offering old shows. Like, why would anyone want to watch that? But they did offer an experience, and people began to appreciate that experience. The choice, the ability to watch on your own schedule, and to watch without commercials, even at a fee. One of the interesting aspects of doing the comparison of the four industries is putting newspapers and television up against each other, because ostensibly they're both attention businesses, right? And yet the story for television and the story for newspapers are quite different. And newspaper revenue, television revenue, flat, right? So why is that? I think that offers additional evidence about this notion that it's the advertising tools. And the advertising tools aren't purely substitutes, or they're more substitutive for what newspapers were providing than for what television provides. One, because television is video. Yes, there are also online video ads, but also the nature of what a television ad is, a mass exposure. And I think part of this also ties back to the fact that not every advertiser wants the same thing, and not every advertiser wants the same thing at the same time. And that many who have the budgets to support television have continued to spend in television and push 10, 20% off in other tools, rather than moving their whole budgets there in the way that print budgets really did get moved entirely to digital. So what will happen next for television? And there's a lot of concern. There's certainly a discourse that we are on a track where we used to have broadcasting and cable and satellite, and in the future it will all be internet distributed. And I'm not so sure about that. I think more we're at a moment in which television splits a bit. And television there's a lot on television. And when I talked about kindling, I really only talked about one form. Right? Scripted series and movies, right? Scripted series and movies are particularly well suited to streaming services. They're better watched on your own pace, preferably without commercials. And yet an entire television universe remains tied to a schedule, to people watching at a certain time and watching the commercials in it, news, sports, breakfast shows. Those are all a core part of television. And so I wonder a bit if we're at a point that's not dissimilar from radio in the late 1940s. I know the story in the US better than Australia, but in the US, evenings on radio were taken up with dramas and comedies. And if you would have told someone, I imagine, at the end of the 40s that in the future radio will have no drama and comedies, they would have thought you were crazy. But when television came along and offered those dramas and comedies with pictures, radio recognized the affordance is better. We have our own strengths. We're not going to die. The radio industry in the US began focusing on a younger demographic. Entities known as black format radio stations emerged. Something like 400 news stations launched in 1952 alone. So radio figured out how it could be something different than it had been because comedy and drama had gone to television. And I suspect it's similarly impossible to imagine that television could, in 5 years, not have any drama, comedies, or movies on it. But that might just be the reality, at least from a business standpoint. That doesn't mean television dies. It means television adapts. It's been adapting. So the story, drawing it all together, clearly the internet has been a common cause of disruption, much like mechanization was in the 19th century. But its implications, what it has meant in different sectors, what its consequences have been quite wide-ranging. And that makes sort of simple grand theories difficult. If there were a grand theory, a lesser-known theory by Clayton Christensen is quite helpful. And this is his theory, cleverly named jobs to be done. The theory of jobs to be done has businesses focus on the job that they do for consumers. In other words, why is it that consumers hire them? Right? So it's a consumer-centric strategy. So to illustrate this, imagine if in the late 1990s, the recording industry had said, it's this new technology, the music file. How can we embrace the music file to create a better experience for listeners? The story may have ended up being a bit different. And if we're honest, and we look at what are largely regarded at this point as the success stories, streaming music services and video services in particular, those that are new entrants, largely this is what they did. They recognized what the new technology could do to improve experience, and they figured out, despite all of a whole lot of naysaying about, well, the industry can't do that, they figured out how to make it happen. And they're in a position of strength today. I don't mean to minimize the challenges facing incumbents, right? Because the reality is that those entities that chose not to embrace the technology to improve the experience, it did so for reasons tied closely to their fiduciary expectations of their stockholders. It's hard to be the incumbent, but there are strategies available. Particularly the idea of tending your kindling, right? There aren't surprising stories in this talk. These industries do, in many cases, that they were providing a suboptimal experience for their consumers. But they could, right? The conditions were such, the playing field was set a certain way that we can provide this even though people want something else. But appreciating what could catch fire and having a plan for it, that is a possible solution. I think in the next decade, we'll begin to hear more of these stories from within the companies about how this change was managed. And for example, just from what is known on the outside at Disney, the pace at which Disney announced the Disney Plus streaming service, brought it to market a good product. That didn't just happen in the 18 months in which all that information was public, right? That was a path to change that had been charted probably over a decade, right? That's tending the kindling. Recognizing that Netflix coming in, Netflix isn't new media and we're old media. We can do exactly the same thing. We're going to need to do the same thing. So we might as well start developing a different way to distribute content, a different business model for our content. And when the time comes, and in this case, the time came when subscribers started leaving cable packages in significant enough numbers, they were able to transition and reach consumers in a different way. The internet may be widely disruptive, but it is disruptive to different industries for quite different reasons. And it's these differences that make it foolish to go in search of singular theories about how to prepare for and respond to disruption. I don't want to write a second edition of this book, but I'm quite convinced we're not fully through all of the disruption. As I suggested about the recording industry, I think we'll see in other industries as well, a continued shift in the middle practices. If you followed the news out of the US in the last week or so, and the news of strikes, that's what's happening right now, right? So in the US, we've gone from, with video, a process in which entities make video product. And it used to be that you'd sell it again and again in different markets. So you continue to earn revenue from that. The people who made it would continue to earn revenue based on those sales. And those sales were tied to a specific title and property. When you change the system entirely, and you have one entity buying that product for 15 years, if not forever, and you don't know how much money that one title makes, that makes those old ways of paying people not very effective. So we're starting to work through that now. The other place that I don't think we've really fully seen the change to come is tied to what these industries now know about consumers and the experiences that they're having with more choice. Right? So the famous saying in Hollywood was "nobody knows," which spoke to the way that media industries are not nearly as predictable as so many others, that viewers and listeners are fickle, and you can't really predict what's going to be a hit. But part of the reason why you couldn't predict what was going to be a hit was because we knew so little. We knew how many seats were filled at the 8:30 showing, or Nielsen gave us a decent idea of how many people were in the audience at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. But we didn't have the ability to follow that person and begin to have a sense of their media consumption experience. And that is one of the things that data gathering capability is what streaming services, music and video allow. And I think it would not at all be surprising to begin to see the things that are learned from that data coming back to how artists are developed, how content is developed, what content is developed. Whether or not that will be a good or bad thing remains to be seen, but I think it is likely the case. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have I don't see a clock, but I think we have a few minutes left for questions. I will navigate the questions in the room, and Patrick is responsible for navigating the questions online. So I believe if you are online, feel free to use the Q&A function to raise your question, and Patrick will ask it on your behalf. Do we have any online questions yet? No online questions yet. Is there anyone in the room that would like to ask Amanda a question?
I'll take the first. Thank you, Amanda. The question comes back to what you kind of finished on with television and sport, particularly. And sport's a really interesting one because of the experience of co-watching, and I guess that in television land, it's perhaps a little bit different. Is there a difference there? I mean, you've kind of focused, I guess, at the high level, but within these particular categories, I noticed with music as well, you didn't really touch on live music. That are there kind of hills and plateaus within these particular sectors that are interesting, that might kind of diverge or go their own way? Could you see like schisms forming?
Yeah, the media industry scholarship puts live music in one category and recorded in another. So I focus on recorded, and popular music's in one and classics in another, and I'm focused on popular. So yeah, there's all sorts of sector specificity. I think, we even need to drill down farther into sport and recognize that there are differences within. Right now, sport, much everywhere in the world that I am aware of, is the thing that is gathering mass audiences, and it may be the only thing gathering mass audiences. And because of that, economically, for major sports leagues, it's still more financially advantageous for them to sell rights, often exclusive rights to television, and that there's more money to be made in that place. But there are other things going on around the edges, right? Like, so many sports are only attractive in a particular nation, and so they would be unavailable everywhere else in the past, right? Nobody's going to. A case I'm somewhat familiar with are European football rights in Australia, let's say. Right, most games air between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. So it's not really a right that many linear channels ever wanted. However, there are now streaming services that can step in and fill those gaps. The sports streaming services that do exist largely either serve out of market or they're minor sports. In other words, sports that aren't big enough to attract a linear license. Will that change over time? Perhaps. Sport works really well in the live environment. And the advertisers are also kind of eager to keep it there. Our attention is getting harder and harder to get. And that's why they are actually paying more and more. The reason television advertising is flat, even though the number of viewers has declined significantly. So advertisers are paying more for fewer viewers because that attention is so valuable. So I think it's going to depend on whether or not as cultures we walk away from sport and watching it live, but I haven't seen much in the way of evidence of that.
Amanda, I have a question from online audience. It's Guy asking, is there kindling in the SVOD, I hope I'm saying that right, ecology by any chance?
Kindling in the SVOD ecology. That's an interesting question. So, and I think that the question in the SVOD space, and that's the streaming services, subscriber funded video on demand. I think the question is whether or not, we don't yet know where the threshold is for services that people want to pay for. Right, so just really in the last couple years, haven't been typical of much. A lot of major US services have come to market and are increasingly pushing out internationally. And there's a lot that's unclear as to who has a big enough library to succeed, whether they've figured out that actually providing an SVOD product is different than the thinking behind the product that was used to attract a audience at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night on some broadcast channel, or the kind of content that you'd put in a movie theater, right? The things that we will pay for are different than the things that we will give our attention to for free. So I'm not sure that we're at the point where we have kindling yet, but we are definitely unclear where the boundaries are about the scale of value proposition needed to be viable. And I think the other piece of that, though, as well, is I don't think we know where the threshold is in terms of audience scale. Right? So we're seeing the push to international, but in order to succeed, it's not clear that these services have to be, in more than 10% of homes in more than a few countries. So I think generally it's just such unfamiliar territory that we're not yet clear where the economic thresholds are. That's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. I also have a kindling question. I really enjoy how Anand's concept is developed by you and how that's applied. I think there's something kind of inherently ubiquitous and almost hidden about this notion of kindling. Like, it speaks to this sort of dissatisfaction that is around us and is highlighted by this disruption. But I guess digital and the disruption that comes with it also brings some kind of hidden and unexpected delights and positives for a user experience. I'm thinking of, small examples like Amazon Prime and the fact that it has an X-ray function, which when you bring it up will immediately tell you who the actors are and what the scene is and provide this layer of information that previously wouldn't have been available to us. So my question is, alongside those sort of frustration associations of kindling, are you also sort of finding that there's some more positive, small delights, small moments for users that actually provide some satisfaction and some, the inversion of kindling almost, a little waterhole they might encounter or something?
I'd need to think about this more, but my initial response is I wonder to what degree Kindling and sort of value proposition are, running opposite each other, right? And the way in which various affordances of the digital have enabled a different value proposition to be offered. And I think really one of the keys there is just the flexibility, right? Like often the cost of providing something like that X-ray service, like that may be great for you. I may not even know it exists. I may never use it, right? Similarly, for the range of experiences, let's say that a music streaming service offers, right? Like every day I find something I had no idea existed, right? But it may be crucial to the music experience for somebody else. So I think that flexibility is important on the business side, but I think it also poses a big challenge. I've had like kind of business industry hat on today, but if you put on the culture hat, it's really hard, right? This notion that, Oliver, did you see the numbers today? 240 million, I don't know what Netflix announced, right? That many million people have the service, but how many, what are they watching in common? Apparently a lot of Squid Game. But other than that, what is the cultural experience? How many people are digging into those digital offerings, and how is that changing what video or music or a print culture means to them? And those are questions I think that we can only get at by studying audiences and talking to them about how they use media now, how they feel about it, how it is important to them, the things that they feel that they've lost, the things that they've found that they never thought that they'd wanted and are now crucial to their experience. So I think we have a lot to learn in that regard.
I think there's some online questions from Patrick.
That's right. We have an online question from Nicola. I was wondering whether similar thinking could be applied to the book industry as another key media player.
Probably. I will note that with great respect, I knew John Thompson was writing a very good book called Book Wars and stayed clear of it because I knew he would know more than I would. I mean, the book industry is actually interesting in some ways for the ways that many people thought that people would stop reading entirely, and that kind of didn't happen. I think the book industry arguably has been less disrupted than most everybody believed. But I think, of course, that there was Kindling there. I think there certainly continues to be the mass market books that there have always been. But one of the things that Thompson talks about is the enormous sector of self-publishing that now exists again, and books that are read by millions, right? And so, what was the Kindling? The Kindling were the gatekeepers that kept certain ideas limited. Thompson's also found really significant differences in different sectors. And so some sectors were significantly affected by ebooks, many not at all. And so I think the idea that there were biases, there were implications for different sectors of books that perhaps the ability to both self-publish, buy through retailers like Amazon or Booktopia, and there's a third thing in my head, but I've lost it. All of those things, I think, change different parts of the book industry as well. So yes, I'm sure there's lots to do there.
So we have another one online. This is a little bit longer. Anecdotally, this is from Tama. Piracy looks to have been on the rise in Australia across the last year. Having affordable, accessible streaming platforms was widely considered an important antidote to piracy. However, given the increasing number of film and TV subscription-based streaming services and resurgence of different dates for cinema release across the world, such as Bond or Dune in Australia, do you see the size of piracy becoming cyclical rather than something that can be fully solved? That's
a good question. And I think, I pull it apart at the level of value proposition. Yes, if there's only one title you want to watch and the barrier to it in terms of the price for the service relative to the value you feel you're going to get out of it is too high, then yes, of course. That said, I think streaming services aren't like a lot of past technologies, let's say cable and satellite, in that many of them are intentionally being fairly easy to come in and out of, right? And yeah, I am very price conscious, and I do the maths often, right? You know, like, all right, if I have Apple TV Plus for a month, how much can I watch? You know, for $5, and then I move on to the next one, right? So I do think the proliferation of services is an issue. And the services, if they're not providing enough titles, then that will be a reason that viewers will authorize through unauthorized means. But the other point that we don't always consider piracy is password sharing. And I do think that also fits in there. And again, it's something that the sector is widely aware of, but has decided at some level it's not worth cracking down on more. But I think what is the best offense there is providing enough of a service at a price point that it is attractive to viewers to just pay for it.
We are at time. So thank you for those of you in the room who had questions. Thank you for those of you online with questions and for all of your attention. And thank you, Amanda, for